The millionaire CEO walked into his office, expecting another ordinary day, until he found two sleeping blonde toddlers in his chair and a note that would change everything. Jason Miller's mornings always started the same way: early, quiet, efficient. He liked to arrive at the office before the rest of the world stirred, when the city was still heavy with morning fog and the building was empty enough to echo. It gave him a sense of control, the illusion of being one step ahead of everything. His tailored coat, dark tie, and polished shoes were all part of the image he wore like armor. Jason wasn't just a CEO, he was the foundation of an empire he had built with precision and discipline. Emotions, unpredictability, those were things he had trained himself to avoid. That's why, on that particular morning, he was entirely unprepared for what he found behind the heavy glass door of his office. He stepped inside, already loosening his coat and pulling his phone from his pocket, intent on reviewing the day's agenda. But he froze mid-step. His office wasn't empty. In the center of the room, curled up in his leather executive chair, were two small boys. They couldn't have been older than 4. Their heads rested against each other's shoulders as they slept soundly. Golden hair tousled, cheeks pink with warmth, they wore simple clothes, sweatshirts, jeans, small sneakers dangling just above the floor. A soft backpack lay near the base of the desk, zipped neatly, as if someone had taken time to prepare it. Jason stared at them in disbelief, his mind scrambling for logic. Was this a mistake? A prank? A security failure? But as he took a slow step forward and looked more closely at their faces, something in his chest shifted. Their hair was lighter than his, but the shape of their features, the lines of their jaws, the curve of their brows, and, most of all, the unmistakable blue of their eyes stopped him cold. They had his eyes, not similar, identical. He didn't move, afraid to wake them, afraid of what it would mean if this moment was real. 1,000 questions filled his mind, loud and clashing. Who were they? How had they gotten in? Why were they in his chair, in his office, alone? The door behind him opened sharply, and his assistant stepped in, out of breath. She froze when she saw the scene, then rushed forward with wide eyes, a stack of papers nearly slipping from her hands. Mr. Miller, I'm so sorry. Security found them downstairs this morning. They were on the lobby couch. There was no adult, just this. She handed him a folded note. Jason took it slowly. The paper was cheap and lined, the handwriting uneven but readable. Take care of them. They have no one else but you. There was no name, no explanation, no contact information. His hands trembled slightly as he read it again. The boys shifted in their sleep but didn't wake. One turned his face just enough for Jason to see the exact tilt of a jawline that could have been his own at that age. His assistant waited, clearly unsure whether to speak or leave, but Jason couldn't answer. He couldn't think. He just stood there with the weight of a lifetime of silence, suddenly sitting in his office chair, breathing quietly in two tiny bodies. His voice, when it came, was quiet. Don't touch them, he said. Don't call anyone. Not yet. She hesitated, nodded once, and stepped back. Jason lowered himself into the chair across from them, the one he used during interviews and board meetings. For the first time in years, he felt like a man who had no idea what came next. Jason sat in silence, barely aware of the ticking clock on the wall or the soft footsteps echoing through the corridor outside his office. All of his carefully laid plans for the day. Meetings, reports, investor calls blurred into irrelevance as he watched the two boys continue to sleep peacefully in his chair. They looked so comfortable, as if they belonged there, as if this office, this cold space filled with polished surfaces and structured routine, had somehow become a shelter. The light from the windows cast a pale glow across their small faces, highlighting their soft features and the undeniable resemblance to him. It wasn't just in their eyes. It was in their expressions, the way their brows furrowed slightly even in sleep, the curve of their mouths, the same subtle tilt of the chin that he saw in the mirror every morning. He didn't know how long he stared before the taller of the two stirred. The boy blinked up at him with confusion, then sat up, gently nudging his brother awake. Neither of them looked frightened, only a little unsure. Jason opened his mouth, then closed it again. He didn't know what to say. What could he say? Hi, I'm the stranger whose chair you're in. The father you never met? The boys looked at him, their eyes flicking between him and the note now resting on his desk. Jason forced himself to smile, though it felt foreign. "Hey," he said quietly. "I'm Jason." The boys didn't respond immediately. The smaller one, with a faint scar above his eyebrow, held the other's hand tightly. That simple gesture hit Jason harder than anything else. They were holding on to each other in a room full of unfamiliar things, as if they knew they were all the other had. He stood and moved slowly, crouching down in front of them, trying not to tower or intimidate. "Are you okay? Are you hungry? Thirsty?" The smaller one nodded. The other stayed quiet, still watching him carefully, measuring him. Jason stood again and called his assistant. "Get them something to eat. Real food, not from the vending machine." She nodded quickly and disappeared. Jason returned to his chair, the one across from them, and sat down, trying to appear calm. "Do you know who I am?" he asked gently. The smaller boy nodded again. "You're Jason Miller," he said softly. "Our mom said that's your name." Jason's breath caught. It was surreal to hear it spoken out loud. "What's your mom's name?" he asked, though in his heart he already knew. The boys exchanged a glance. Then the older one finally spoke. "Emily. Emily Carter." It felt like time collapsed. Emily, a name he hadn't spoken in years. A woman whose departure had felt sudden but not significant at the time. A brief relationship, unplanned and unremarkable, or so he had told himself. He hadn't even known she was pregnant. And now here were these boys, his sons. And she had sent them to him, or left them. He didn't yet know which. He sat in stunned silence as food arrived, and the boys began to eat quietly at the small round meeting table. They were polite, gentle, like they'd been taught not to make trouble. He couldn't stop watching them, couldn't stop thinking about all the years that had passed without him knowing they existed, the missed birthdays, the first steps, the scraped knees he hadn't been there to soothe. After they finished, one of them asked softly, "Are we going back now?" Jason swallowed hard. "Back where?" The boy shrugged. "Home with mommy." Jason's voice failed him for a moment. "Do you know where she is?" Another pause. "She said if anything ever happened, we should come here. That you'd find us." It was too much, too sudden, too deep. He stood slowly, walked to the window, and stared out at the city he thought he knew so well. For the first time in a very long time, Jason Miller felt completely lost. Jason spent the rest of the day in a daze, walking through the motions of his executive role while his mind remained trapped in that quiet office with the two little boys who carried his eyes. His assistant had moved them temporarily to the lounge area just outside his suite, where they now sat with coloring books and juice boxes under the watchful eyes of two junior staff members who had no idea how to explain what was happening. Jason didn't either. He canceled all his meetings with a few clipped words, ignoring the confusion and whispers that rippled through the upper floors of the company. No one dared to question him directly, but the sight of two young children sitting quietly in the CEO's private space did not go unnoticed. Jason didn't care. His entire world had shifted, and the weight of it pressed heavily on every breath he took. By the time evening crept in and the building emptied out, he had already made 2 calls, one to a private investigator he trusted implicitly and one to his lawyer. He didn't bother to explain everything, just enough. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. The children were clearly his, of that he had no doubt. But the circumstances of how and why they had ended up in his office were still wrapped in silence. He needed to find Emily. He needed to know what had happened to her and what kind of life she and the boys had been living while he built his empire in blissful ignorance. As he sat alone in his darkened office, he reviewed the last time he had seen Emily. She had worked in public relations, a quiet but competent presence in meetings. They had been involved for only a few months, a period he remembered with little clarity. He had been focused on expansion, distracted by the pursuit of a merger that demanded everything from him. She had resigned unexpectedly, leaving behind only a brief letter thanking him for the opportunity. He hadn't thought much of it then. There had been no confrontation, no goodbye. And now, 5 years later, 2 living pieces of her had arrived at his doorstep, waiting for answers he didn't have. The investigator called just after 9 p.m. Her voice was calm, but her words were anything but. Emily Carter had been involved in a car accident nearly 3 months ago. She was alive, but barely. She was in a long-term care facility in the city, in a coma since the night of the crash. No known family, no emergency contacts. She had listed a guardian in case of emergency, Jason Miller, his own name. That one detail struck him harder than all the others combined. She had trusted him. After all this time, after his silence, she had still trusted that if something happened, he would come for them. He left the office immediately. The building was mostly dark, but the boys were still waiting near the front reception desk, bundled in borrowed jackets and holding hands like they were one person split in two. They looked up at him, not with fear, but with that same strange mixture of familiarity and hope that continued to unravel him from the inside out. "We're going," he said gently, crouching down to meet their eyes. "To see your mom." They didn't ask questions. They only stood up and followed him, their small feet echoing in the marble lobby. Jason had never been so uncertain in his life. But he knew one thing with complete clarity: he would not leave these boys again. No matter what waited behind the hospital doors, he was walking through them. And this time, he wouldn't walk away. The ride to the hospital was quiet, the kind of silence that weighed more heavily than any words. The twins sat in the back seat, buckled in side by side, their faces pressed to the windows, watching the lights of the city flicker past. Jason kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror, trying to see something beyond their identical features, some expression or flicker that might give him a sense of what they were feeling, but they remained unreadable. He felt an unfamiliar pressure in his chest, something close to fear, though not the kind he was used to. This wasn't about losing control of a business or a deal. This was about walking into a past he had chosen to forget and into a future he had never prepared for. The long-term care facility sat quietly off a side street, tucked between 2 office buildings and wrapped in cold white light. The parking lot was mostly empty when they arrived, and the air outside was colder than he expected. He helped the boys out of the car, guiding them gently by the shoulders, not because they needed help walking, but because he needed to feel like he was doing something. They held hands again as they entered a small unit of trust he hadn't yet earned but had somehow been granted access to. Inside, the nurse at the front desk recognized Emily's name immediately. Jason gave his own without thinking, and her face changed just slightly when she found him listed as the emergency contact. No questions were asked, only a quiet nod and a gesture toward the elevator. The boys walked beside him silently, their shoes squeaking faintly against the tile floor. Jason's heart pounded harder the closer they got to her room. Part of him still couldn't believe this was real, that just hours ago he had been reviewing numbers and sending emails, living a life that now felt like someone else's. When they stepped into the room, time seemed to slow. Emily lay still in a narrow bed, surrounded by quiet machines that beeped in steady intervals. Her skin was pale, her hair tucked behind her ears by someone who had taken the time to keep her looking cared for. There were no flowers, no photos, no signs that anyone had visited until now. The boys didn't speak. They moved to her side naturally, as if they had done it 1,000 times. One of them climbed carefully onto the chair beside her bed, reaching for her hand without hesitation. Jason stood frozen near the door, unable to move, watching them as if from a distance. He had no idea what he expected, maybe anger, maybe grief, but what he saw was something else entirely: acceptance. He finally stepped forward slowly until he was at the foot of her bed. His eyes scanned her face, trying to remember the woman she had been when they met. Back then, she was quiet but smart, always a step ahead in meetings, with a sharp wit she only used when necessary. He remembered the way she had smiled once when he complimented her on a report, the way she used to wear her hair pulled into a loose braid when she stayed late. He didn't remember ever seeing her scared. But now she looked fragile, like someone suspended between this world and the next, and he couldn't stop thinking about how she must have felt, alone with no one to call but him. A nurse stepped in and checked the monitors. Jason pulled her aside quietly, asking for details. The prognosis was uncertain. She had suffered a traumatic brain injury. She was stable but unresponsive. Some patients recovered, some didn't. No one could say which she would be. He returned to the boys, who hadn't left her side. One of them looked up at him and whispered, "Is Mommy going to wake up?" The question was a dagger. Jason knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We don't know yet," he said honestly. "But we're here now. She's not alone anymore." They stayed there for hours until the boys began to fall asleep, curled up beside her, their small bodies breathing in sync with the rhythm of the machines. Jason didn't leave. He sat in the chair in the corner of the room, watching them all, and felt the full weight of what had been given to him, the responsibility, the guilt, and the fragile, unfinished gift of being allowed back into their lives. He didn't deserve it, but he would not waste it. That night, for the first time in years, Jason Miller did not think about business or the market or his schedule for the next day. He thought only about her, about them, and about the long road ahead, and he silently promised himself he would walk every step of it. The days that followed became a blur of new routines and quiet realizations. Jason took time off from work for the first time in over a decade, something that stunned his staff and unsettled his board of directors. He gave them no explanation other than a vague family emergency and trusted his most senior advisor to hold things together while he stepped back. He didn't care what it looked like. The life he had built, polished, efficient, all-consuming, suddenly felt far away and hollow compared to the reality of two 4-year-old boys who needed more than just a name on a birth certificate. He moved the twins into his penthouse temporarily, though he quickly realized how unfit the space was for children. Everything was made of glass and steel, sharp-edged and expensive, and completely devoid of warmth. He cleared out his home office to make room for 2 small beds, bought toys he didn't understand, and stood helpless in the supermarket aisle, wondering which cereal to choose. He didn't know their routines, their favorite colors, what scared them at night, or what made them laugh uncontrollably. He didn't know what they'd been through with Emily, how she had raised them, or what she had told them about him, if anything at all. But they didn't act angry. They didn't demand answers. They simply watched him closely, as if waiting to see who he would become now that he had them in his care. Mornings were clumsy. Jason burned toast more often than not, spilled juice on marble counters, and gave up trying to tie their shoelaces properly without their help. The boys were patient with him in the way only young children could be, curious, observant, quietly hopeful. He started reading bedtime stories, stumbling over silly voices that made them giggle under the blankets. He learned they liked dinosaur books, that one of them, Liam, hated bananas, and the other, Lucas, liked to line up his toy cars in perfect rows before bed. He watched them draw pictures of themselves with a man they started calling Dad without hesitation. And every time he heard that word, it shook something loose inside him. Each evening, they visited the hospital. The twins brought new drawings for Emily, telling her about their day, even though she couldn't answer. Jason watched them sit by her bed, talking to her as if she was just asleep, as if she'd wake any moment and ask them to tell it all again. Sometimes he stayed in the corner and said nothing. Other times, he sat beside them and whispered apologies to the woman who had once trusted him enough to carry this burden alone. The guilt never left him. It sat quietly in the background of every smile, every laugh, every bedtime prayer. One afternoon, after the boys had gone home with his assistant for the night, Jason remained at the hospital longer than usual. He took a seat next to Emily's bed and looked at her face, pale but peaceful, her hand resting lightly under the blanket. He remembered how strong she had been, how she had never asked him for anything, even when he pulled away from the relationship. Back then, she must have already known she was pregnant. And still, she left without a word, choosing not to fight a battle he wasn't ready for. And now she had sent their sons to him with nothing but a note, believing that he would find his way to them somehow. He spoke softly, more to himself than to her. He told her about their days, how Liam liked superhero socks and Lucas hated bedtime, how both boys had memorized the security code to the building and insisted on punching it in themselves. He told her how they missed her, how unprepared he felt, how terrified he was of failing them again. And then, after a long pause, he said what had been building in him since the first morning in his office. "I never wanted to be a father because I was afraid I'd be like mine, absent, distracted, more committed to work than to life. I thought staying away would save them from that. But I was wrong. All they needed was someone who stayed. And I'm staying."
I'm not going anywhere now."
There was no response, only the hum of machines and the sound of distant voices in the hallway. But in that quiet room, something shifted. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden movement, no miracle awakening. Just a deep, unfamiliar stillness inside him that finally felt like peace. And for Jason Miller, who had lived his whole life outrunning anything that asked too much of his heart, that was everything. Winter crept in slowly, casting a gray chill across the city and frosting the tall windows of Jason's penthouse with delicate patterns of ice. The twins had begun to settle into their new routines, and Jason, to his own astonishment, was settling into fatherhood. Each day brought new discoveries, not only about the boys, Liam's quiet stubbornness, Lucas's habit of humming when he focused, their shared fascination with building blocks and anything sweet, but also about himself. He had thought parenting would be about structure and control, things he understood well, but instead, it was about flexibility, mess, and listening closely even when words weren't being said. He found himself changing in ways he couldn't have predicted. He now kept his phone on silent for hours at a time and had learned to ignore emails while helping Liam find a missing sock or trying to untangle Lucas's small fingers from a tub of spilled paint. His apartment had transformed from a minimalist showroom into a space that actually looked lived in. Toys cluttered the corners, drawings decorated the fridge, and the once pristine marble countertops were now smudged with flour and fingerprints more often than not. And yet, Jason didn't mind. In fact, he found himself oddly comforted by the chaos, as though it proved something he had never dared to hope for, that he belonged to something real. They continued visiting Emily every evening, and though her condition remained unchanged, the routine became sacred. The boys would carry in their stories from the day, their crayon pictures folded carefully in their jacket pockets, and place them on the table beside her bed. They would take turns holding her hand, telling her about breakfast disasters or what they had learned at preschool. Jason would sit nearby, watching them with a quiet ache in his chest, always wondering if she could hear them, always wishing she would open her eyes and see what had become of the world she left behind. One snowy afternoon, as the boys napped on the couch after an impromptu pillow fort session, Jason sat at the kitchen table staring at an email from his company's board of directors. They were asking for a decision. His temporary leave was nearing its end, and they needed to know if he was returning or stepping down. For a long time, he had assumed he would go back. It was his company, his identity. But as he sat in that kitchen, surrounded by evidence of a life far messier and more meaningful than the one he'd left behind, he realized he no longer wanted to lead the world from a corner office. He didn't want to be a man driven by spreadsheets and empty victories. That night, after the boys had gone to sleep and the apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater, Jason pulled out his laptop and drafted a letter of resignation. It wasn't bitter or dramatic. It was simple, honest. He thanked the board for their trust and acknowledged the work they had done together, but he ended it with a truth he had finally accepted: his legacy was not in numbers or public recognition, but in the small voices that now called him Daddy. The next morning, Jason made pancakes from scratch, burned the first batch, and laughed when the boys asked if they could help fix it. He handed them each a spoon and let them stir the batter, flour dusting the air and landing in their hair. For the first time in as long as he could remember, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Later, as they walked through the snow toward the hospital once again, Lucas slipped his hand into Jason's without looking up, and Jason squeezed it gently, the cold forgotten in the warmth of that simple connection. They entered the hospital just as they always did, greeted the familiar nurses, and stepped into the room that had slowly become a second home. But this time, something was different. Jason couldn't say what at first. It was just a stillness, a sense of something quietly shifting in the air. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. The lights cast their usual soft glow, but Emily's fingers twitched as Liam placed a drawing in her hand. Just once, barely visible, but it was enough. Jason leaned in closer, calling her name softly, and for a breathless moment, he saw it. Her eyelids fluttered, only for a second. But this time, the hope wasn't imagined. He looked at his sons, who stared at their mother with wide eyes, and he realized that no matter what happened next, everything had already changed, not because life had gone back to what it once was, but because they had built something new. And now, perhaps it was her turn to come home to it. The week that followed was a cautious walk between hope and fear. Emily's momentary movement, the subtle twitch of her fingers, the flicker of her eyelids had left the doctors intrigued but careful in their assessments. Jason didn't allow himself to celebrate too early, but inside, something in him had already begun to stir. That moment had cracked open the solid wall of uncertainty that had defined the past months. The boys, however, didn't hesitate. They believed fully and without doubt that their mother was coming back. Every day, they brought more drawings, sang softly to her, and told her long stories with the faith only children could carry unshaken. Jason found himself watching Emily more closely. He noticed details he'd never paid attention to before, the faint freckles near her temple, the curve of her fingers, the quiet strength still visible in her body despite the stillness. He talked to her often, not only about the boys, but about memories he had buried or ignored. He told her about the first time he'd seen her in that boardroom, about how he had admired her confidence, even though he hadn't known what to do with it. He told her about the fear that had driven him away when things got serious and the regret that never left him once he learned the truth. There was no one else to hear him in that room, no judgment, only the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she could hear him now. The boys had become part of the hospital's rhythm. Nurses greeted them by name, slipping them extra cookies or showing them pictures from the break room bulletin board. Doctors smiled when they came down the hall, whispering updates to Jason when the twins were distracted with picture books or puzzles in the waiting area. Each day brought small signs. Emily's hands began to move more, her eyelids twitched more regularly. One afternoon, when Jason was adjusting her blanket, her lips parted slightly, and he could have sworn he heard a whisper. It was not a word, not yet, but it was real. The boys didn't need proof, they already believed. But Jason finally began to as well. At home, life continued with its strange, beautiful chaos. The twins had begun calling Jason Daddy without hesitation, and he no longer flinched when they said it. He had learned to pack lunches with notes inside, to braid plastic dinosaurs into hairlines, to handle tantrums about bedtime socks, and to share endless retellings of a cartoon character named Rocket Dog. They were his now, in a way that wasn't about biology or legal papers, but about presence, about choice. Every scraped knee and whispered goodnight made that bond stronger. One evening, as snow fell lightly outside and the twins played in the living room under a fortress of pillows, Jason found himself standing at the edge of it all, just watching. There was a lightness in the room that he couldn't remember ever feeling in his life, not in boardrooms, not at charity galas or launch events. It was something quieter, more complete. When Lucas peeked out and shouted, "Daddy, come be the dragon," Jason laughed and crawled in without hesitation, letting himself be covered in blankets and shrieks of delight. He wasn't pretending anymore. This was real. Later that night, after they had fallen asleep in a heap of blankets on the floor, Jason sat beside them and let the quiet wrap around him. He thought of Emily, of the day she had left the company, and wondered what it must have been like for her to walk away from him, knowing what she carried inside. He wished he had asked. He wished he had listened. But most of all, he was grateful she had trusted him in the end, even when he hadn't earned it. He hoped she would wake soon, not because he needed her forgiveness, but because he wanted her to see what had grown in her absence. The next morning, they walked into the hospital room as usual, arms full of drawings and stuffed animals. But something had changed. The room was warmer, brighter. And when Jason stepped in, he froze. Emily's eyes were open. She was looking at him, at the boys, not confused, not afraid, just tired and clear and alive. Liam gasped. Lucas dropped his picture. Jason crossed the room in 3 steps and sank beside her, reaching for her hand. She smiled, barely, her lips cracked and dry. And when she spoke, her voice was little more than a breath. "You kept them safe." He nodded, unable to speak. The boys clung to him, wide-eyed and frozen in wonder. She looked at all 3 of them, and then her gaze returned to Jason. "You came back." And in that moment, the future opened like sunlight through snow-covered branches, fragile, bright, and full of life. Recovery was slow but steady. After waking, Emily spent several days barely speaking, drifting in and out of sleep as her body adjusted to awareness again. The doctors were optimistic but measured, reminding Jason that even though she had returned to consciousness, her body and mind had been through immense trauma.
The boys, however, didn't need those warnings. They were simply happy. They visited every day with renewed energy, bringing books and stories, and sometimes just curling up next to her bed, content to be near her now that her eyes followed their movements and her hands squeezed back when they held them. It didn't matter that she couldn't talk much or stay awake long. She was there. That was enough. Jason stayed close. He managed every detail of her care, brought her clothes, cleaned her room when nurses were busy, and spoke to every specialist himself. He was no longer just an observer in the hospital, he was her partner, and the staff began to treat him as such. He kept a notebook where he tracked her medications, her vitals, and every tiny milestone: the day she sat up by herself, the first time she asked for water, the first time she whispered the boys' names. The more she returned, the more the weight in his chest lifted, but it was replaced by something just as heavy: responsibility. He wasn't just holding a space for her return anymore. He was building the life she would come back to. Emily moved to a rehabilitation facility 2 weeks after waking, and Jason and the boys visited daily. The twins became little fixtures in the halls, waving at nurses and helping push her wheelchair when she was too tired to walk. Jason brought meals from home, helped with her physical therapy stretches when allowed, and sat beside her for hours, telling her everything he hadn't before. He didn't avoid the hard things. He told her the truth about how selfish he had been, how blind, how afraid. She listened. Sometimes she cried, sometimes she was silent, and sometimes she simply took his hand and let it stay there. Forgiveness, he learned, wasn't a single moment. It was something built over time, in glances and quiet reassurances, and in the act of not leaving when things got difficult. By spring, Emily was strong enough to return home. But this time, she didn't go back to the apartment she had once lived in alone. She came to Jason's home, one now filled with drawings, laughter, chipped mugs, forgotten socks, and the unmistakable echo of children growing up. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. She walked through the door slowly, her sons rushing to hug her, Jason waiting quietly behind them. She looked around and smiled at the changes. Her life, once paused in a sterile hospital room, had continued in ways she never imagined. They moved forward together, not as people trying to fix the past, but as a family, choosing to honor what had survived it. Jason adjusted to this new life with gratitude he didn't always know how to express. He learned to be present, not just in big moments, but in the small ones: the way the boys waited for him at the school gate, the way Emily laughed when she forgot the grocery list, the way silence felt comforting now instead of cold. One Sunday afternoon, as they all sat on a picnic blanket in the park, Emily resting against him, the boys chasing butterflies nearby, Jason looked at them and felt something he had never truly allowed before: peace. Not because everything was fixed, not because guilt was gone, but because he had chosen a different kind of success, one not built in boardrooms or measured in profit, but shaped by the steady rhythm of everyday love. As the sun dipped lower and the boys ran back with grass-stained knees and tangled hair, Jason pulled them into his arms and kissed their foreheads. Emily leaned into his shoulder, her voice soft against his ear. "You found your way." And Jason, looking at his sons, his partner, and the life he had almost missed, whispered back, "Thanks to all of you." They stayed there as the sky turned gold, not needing anything more than what they already had. And for the first time, Jason didn't think about what came next. He simply breathed it in. What I love most about the ending of this story is its quiet strength. It doesn't rely on dramatic twists or perfect resolutions, but instead finds its power in emotional honesty and earned connection. Jason's transformation isn't sudden. It's slow, sometimes messy, and deeply human. Watching a man so rooted in control and isolation grow into someone who embraces love, presence, and vulnerability feels incredibly rewarding. The story reminds us that redemption doesn't come from grand gestures, but from consistent effort, humility, and the courage to stay when it matters most. The final image, a family healed not by erasing pain, but by choosing to build something new despite it, is the kind of ending that lingers long after the last line.